The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Randy's bar and grill, where Thomas Mitchell sat in his usual corner spot, his calloused fingers wrapped around a glass of bourbon. The ice clinked softly as he took another sip, his eyes fixed on the amber liquid swirling in his glass. At 45, he wasn't old by any means, but life had etched its story across his face. Subtle lines around his eyes, gray streaks at his temples, and a certain heaviness in his gaze that spoke of experiences few would understand. The regulars at Randy's had grown used to his presence over the past 3 years. To them, he was just the local carpenter who fixed their porches, built their cabinets, and disappeared into his workshop for days at a time. They didn't know much about him, and he preferred it that way. Some folks in town called him antisocial, others just shy, but the truth was, Thomas found peace in the quiet. This small Montana town had become his refuge. The mountains reminded him of places far away, but here they felt different, safer somehow. The locals had learned to respect his space, and even Betty, the chatty waitress who could talk the ear off a statue, had come to understand that Thomas preferred subtle nods to lengthy conversations. Tonight was like any other Wednesday. Country music playing softly from the jukebox, the smell of fried onions and burger patties wafting from the kitchen, and the usual crowd of regulars scattered around the bar. Old Pete was at his usual spot by the window, telling anyone who'd listen about his glory days on the high school football team. The Henderson brothers were shooting pool, arguing good-naturedly about who owed who a beer. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn photograph he always carried. He didn't need to look at it anymore. He knew every detail by heart. His daughter Alice on her graduation day, her smile bright enough to light up the whole world. That was before everything changed, before the accident that left him alone in the world. The carpenter's hands that everyone in town knew him for told only part of his story. They were strong and skilled with wood, yes, but they held other memories too. Memories of desert sand, of weapons that were extensions of his body, of brothers in arms who trusted him with their lives. But here in Randy's, those hands just held a bourbon glass, and that's all anyone needed to see. Randy himself was behind the bar tonight, polishing glasses with a worn rag. He was a Vietnam vet, and maybe that's why he never pressed Thomas for small talk. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet respect that needed no words. Randy would occasionally slide a fresh drink Thomas's way before he could ask, and Thomas would respond with a slight nod, their own simple language of mutual recognition. The evening was settling into its usual rhythm when the first rumble of motorcycles echoed from the street outside. It was a sound that didn't belong in their quiet town, especially not on a Wednesday night. Thomas noticed how Randy's hands stilled on the glass he was cleaning, how the conversation at the bar dipped for just a moment before picking up again, a touch more forced than before. Thomas didn't move, didn't even shift in his seat, but something inside him stirred, an old instinct he'd worked hard to bury. He watched the bourbon in his glass ripple with each new rumble of engines, counting them by sound alone, a habit he'd never quite shaken. 6 bikes, he noted, still not looking up. 6 riders who were about to change the quiet evening he planned for himself. The door hadn't opened yet, but Thomas could feel the change in the air. It was like the calm before a storm, that electric tension that makes the hair on your arms stand up. He took another slow sip of his drink, his mind already running through scenarios, exits, angles. Another old habit he'd never managed to break, no matter how peaceful his life had become. The deep rumble of motorcycles grew louder until it felt like the whole building was shaking. Through the window, Thomas could see chrome glinting under the streetlights as 6 bikes pulled into the parking lot. The machines were well maintained, but covered in road dust, telling stories of long miles on back roads. Their riders weren't local. Thomas knew that much just by looking at their unfamiliar patches and colors. The door swung open hard enough to rattle the bell above it, and 6 men walked in like they owned the place. They were road-worn and leather-clad, with patches identifying them as members of the Road Hunters MC. The leader, a big man everyone would soon know as Bear, ducked slightly to clear the doorframe. He had to be close to 6'4", with a gray-streaked beard and arms thick as tree trunks. The atmosphere in Randy's changed instantly. Old Pete stopped mid-story, his football glory days forgotten. The Henderson brothers set their pool cues down quietly, trying not to draw attention. Even Betty, who usually bounced between tables with endless energy, slowed her pace and stuck closer to the kitchen door. Bear's eyes swept across the room, taking in every detail until they landed on Thomas's corner. Something flickered across the big man's face. Maybe annoyance, maybe amusement, or maybe just the natural reaction of a man used to getting his way finding someone else in his preferred spot. He nudged one of his companions, nodding toward Thomas's table. The bikers made their way to the bar first, ordering beers with the kind of voices that were meant to be heard by everyone. They were already pretty drunk, judging by their loud laughter and unstable movements. Randy served them without comment, but Thomas noticed how the older bartender kept his right hand close to the baseball bat he kept under the counter. "Nice little place you got here," Bear called out, his voice carrying that edge that meant it wasn't really a compliment. He turned to face the room, leaning back against the bar. "Real friendly town, too. Passed some folks on the way in. They couldn't wait to wave hello." He chuckled, and his crew joined in, though everyone else in the bar knew that probably wasn't the kind of wave he received. Thomas kept his eyes on his drink, but his awareness had shifted into high gear. He could tell you exactly where each biker was standing, who was left-handed, who had a limp, and which ones kept touching their pockets nervously. Old habits die hard, and these particular habits had kept him alive more times than he cared to count. It didn't take long for Bear to make his move. He grabbed his beer and started toward Thomas's corner, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. His crew followed, spreading out slightly, not deliberately, but with the unconscious spacing of men used to anticipating trouble. They created a loose half-circle around Thomas's table, trying to look casual but failing. "You know," Bear said, his voice dropping to a stage whisper that still carried across the now silent bar. "Me and my boys, we usually sit in this corner when we pass through town. Kind of our lucky spot, you might say." He paused, waiting for a response that didn't come. "Seems like maybe you didn't know that." Thomas took another slow sip of his bourbon, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. He could feel the tension building, could sense Randy moving slightly closer behind the bar, could hear the soft scrape of chairs as other patrons tried to distance themselves from what they thought was coming. The situation was balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and things would get ugly fast. But Thomas had been in tighter spots than this, had faced down worse odds in places where the stakes were much higher. To him, this was just another problem to solve, preferably without anyone getting hurt. Bear's patience was wearing thin with the silence. He shifted his weight, making the floorboards creak under him. "You hard of hearing, friend?" he asked, putting special emphasis on that last word in a way that made it sound like anything but friendly. "Or maybe you just don't know how to show proper respect to visitors." Thomas finally looked up from his drink, his movements unhurried and controlled. He met Bear's eyes with a calm that seemed to puzzle the bigger man. "Evening," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying easily in the tense silence of the bar. "There are plenty of empty tables. Why don't you fellas take your pick?" The response wasn't what Bear expected. He was used to people either backing down immediately or puffing up with false bravado. This quiet confidence threw him off balance for a moment. One of his crew, a younger guy with a fresh-looking tattoo on his neck, snickered nervously. "Well, would you listen to that?" Bear said, leaning forward slightly. "Man's got a voice after all. But maybe you didn't hear me right. This here's our spot. Has been every time we pass through. And right now, you're sitting in it." He placed both hands on the table, looming over Thomas. Thomas didn't lean back or show any sign of intimidation. Instead, he carefully set his glass down and folded his hands in his lap. "I heard you just fine," he replied, "and I'm telling you there are other tables. Your choice which one you'd like." The rest of the bar had gone completely silent. Even the jukebox seemed to be playing softer, as if it too was holding its breath. Randy had moved closer to the phone behind the bar, his hand hovering near it. The Henderson brothers had positioned themselves near the pool table, cue sticks still in hand, watching the scene unfold. Bear straightened up, his face darkening. "Boys," he said to his crew without taking his eyes off Thomas, "I think our friend here needs a lesson in hospitality." His gang moved in closer, creating a tighter circle around the table. The young one with the neck tattoo cracked his knuckles, trying to look tough. Thomas remained still, but something changed in his posture. It wasn't obvious, just a subtle shift in how he held himself, a slight adjustment in the way his feet were planted on the floor. To most people, it would have been invisible. But Randy, watching from behind the bar, recognized it immediately. It was the way soldiers positioned themselves before all hell broke loose. "Look," Thomas said, his voice still calm, but carrying a new edge of authority that made a couple of the bikers glance at each other uncertainly. "I'm having a quiet drink. That's all I want to do. Nobody needs to learn any lessons here." Bear laughed, but it was a forced sound. Something about Thomas's composure was starting to get under his skin. He wasn't used to people staying this calm when faced with 6 angry bikers. "Maybe you don't understand the situation," he growled. "This isn't a request. This is us telling you to move." "I understand perfectly," Thomas replied. "But I was here first, I'm not done with my drink, and I'm not moving." He picked up his glass again, taking another small sip as if to emphasize his point. "Why don't you all just take a step back and think about whether this is really worth the trouble?" The words hung in the air like smoke. Bear's face turned red, his embarrassment at being challenged so calmly in front of his crew turning quickly to anger. One of his hands curled into a fist, while the other reached for Thomas's collar. "Last chance," Bear snarled. "Get up, or we're going to have a real problem." Thomas set his glass down one final time, his movements precise and measured. His eyes, which had been calm throughout the confrontation, suddenly took on a different quality. Sharp, focused, and impossibly alert. It was a look that should have warned them, if they'd been sober enough or smart enough to recognize it. "We already have a problem," Thomas said quietly. "But you're about to have a bigger one if you don't take your hand away from my jacket." His voice wasn't threatening. It was simply stating a fact, which somehow made it all the more unsettling. Bear's grip tightened on Thomas's collar, and that's when it happened. His finger caught the edge of the photo in Thomas's jacket pocket, pulling it partially out. The worn image of his daughter on graduation day fluttered to the floor, landing face up beneath the table. Time seemed to freeze for a moment as Thomas's eyes followed its descent. "Looks like tough guy keeps pictures in his pocket," the young biker with the neck tattoo sneered, bending down to grab it. That was his first mistake. His second was actually touching the photo. Thomas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. Before anyone could blink, his hand caught the young biker's wrist in a grip that made the man's eyes go wide with surprise and pain. "Don't," Thomas said softly, but there was steel in his voice that hadn't been there before. Bear, still holding Thomas's collar, gave a sharp tug. "Let him go, old man, or—" He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion, Thomas twisted slightly, and suddenly Bear's grip was broken. The big man stumbled back, more from shock than force, watching as Thomas carefully retrieved the photo and tucked it back into his pocket. The whole thing had taken maybe 3 seconds, but something fundamental had changed in the bar's atmosphere. The other bikers were no longer smirking. They'd seen enough bar fights to know that what just happened wasn't normal. Normal people didn't move like that, didn't break holds that easily, didn't control situations with such precise movements. "That photo," Thomas said, straightening his jacket, "is the last picture I have of my daughter. She would have turned 25 last month, if she'd lived." His voice was still quiet, but it carried clearly through the silent bar. "Now, I've asked you nicely to leave me alone. I've suggested you take another table. I've given you every chance to walk away." He paused, looking each biker in the eye. "What happens next is entirely up to you." Randy, who had been reaching for the phone to call the sheriff, stopped mid-motion. He'd seen that look before, in another life, on the faces of men who knew exactly what they were capable of. He remembered what those men could do when pushed too far. Bear rubbed his wrist where Thomas had broken his grip. Something like uncertainty flickered across his face, but pride and alcohol pushed him forward. "Get him," he growled to his crew. What happened next was almost beautiful in its efficiency. Thomas rose from his chair in one smooth motion, seemed to flow around the first punch thrown his way. The young biker with the neck tattoo swung wildly and found himself gently but firmly introduced to the floor. Two more rushed forward and somehow ended up tripping over each other. Bear charged like his namesake, but Thomas simply wasn't where he expected him to be. The big man's momentum carried him forward into empty air, and then something happened to his balance that he couldn't quite explain. He found himself sitting on the floor, wondering how he got there. The whole thing lasted maybe 30 seconds, and when it was done, not a single piece of furniture was broken. No blood was spilled, no bones were cracked. Just 5 confused bikers sprawled on the floor and one standing against the wall, trying to figure out how to save face. Thomas stood calmly in the middle of them all, not even breathing hard. He reached down and carefully set his chair upright, then picked up his bourbon glass, which had somehow remained unspilled throughout the entire encounter. The look on his face wasn't triumphant or angry. If anything, he seemed a little sad. "I didn't want trouble," he said quietly, looking at Bear. "Still don't. But that picture, that's all I have left of her. And I learned a long time ago, in places a lot worse than this, that there are some things worth fighting for." The bar remained silent as the bikers slowly got to their feet. There wasn't a mark on any of them, but their pride had taken quite a beating. Bear stood up last, brushing off his leather jacket, his face a mix of confusion and wounded dignity. He opened his mouth to say something, but the sound of the front door opening stopped him. Sheriff Wilson stepped inside, his boots clicking on the wooden floor. He took in the scene with experienced eyes, the scattered bikers, the perfectly calm Thomas, and Randy behind the bar, trying not to smile. The sheriff wasn't a tall man, but he carried himself with the kind of authority that didn't need height to make an impression. "Evening, folks," he said, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Got a call about some possible trouble." His eyes settled on Thomas, and something like recognition flickered across his face. He tilted his head slightly, studying the carpenter with new interest. Bear found his voice first. "No trouble here, Sheriff. Just a little misunderstanding about seating arrangements." He tried to sound casual, but there was a hint of relief in his voice, as if the sheriff's arrival gave him an excuse to back down without losing more face. "Is that right?" Sheriff Wilson asked, but he wasn't looking at Bear anymore. He was looking at Thomas with an expression that had changed from curiosity to certainty. "Say, you wouldn't happen to have served with the 5th Group, would you? Around 2005, near Kandahar." The question hung in the air like smoke. Every eye in the bar turned to Thomas, who took a slow sip of his bourbon before answering. "Might have," he said quietly. "Long time ago." The sheriff nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Thought so. That move you just used. Saw it once before. Training exercise in 05. Master Sergeant took down 6 Rangers in about 10 seconds flat. Never seen anything like it, before or since." Understanding began to dawn on the bikers' faces. Bear's expression shifted from lingering anger to something closer to respect. maybe even a touch of fear. The young one with the neck tattoo whispered something that sounded like special forces to his companion. "Don't matter who he was," Thomas said, still in that quiet voice. "Just a carpenter now. All I wanted was a peaceful drink and to look at my daughter's picture without any fuss." He pulled the photo from his pocket again, looking at it with gentle eyes that seemed at odds with the man who'd just handled 6 bikers without breaking a sweat. The sheriff walked over to the bar, nodding to Randy. "Why don't you pour around for everyone?" "On me." He turned to face the room. "Seems to me we've got some veterans here who just had a little misunderstanding. Might be better to talk about it over a drink than take it outside." Bear looked at his crew, then back at Thomas. Something had changed in his stance. The aggressive swagger was gone, replaced by a more measured consideration. "Been a while since I had a drink with Special Forces," he said slowly. "Served myself, back in 91. Different branch, different war, but—" He let the words trail off, extending his hand to Thomas. Thomas looked at the offered hand for a long moment. Then, carefully tucking his daughter's photo back into his pocket, he reached out and shook it. The tension in the room seemed to deflate like a balloon, replaced by a different kind of energy, something closer to respect. "Never thought I'd find another vet out here," Bear said, pulling up a chair. "Much less someone from the quiet professionals. You gotta tell me, that thing you did with Mike's balance, was that some sort of Special Forces magic?" The atmosphere in Randy's bar had transformed completely. Where there had been tension minutes before, now there was a kind of quiet understanding. Thomas sat at his usual corner table, but this time he wasn't alone. Bear and his crew had pulled up chairs, their earlier hostility replaced by genuine interest. 3 tours, Thomas said quietly, answering Bear's question about his service. Spent most of it training local forces, but sometimes. He let the sentence trail off, taking another sip of his bourbon. The bikers nodded, understanding the weight of what wasn't being said. Randy brought over a fresh round of drinks, setting them down carefully. "On the house," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "Been serving you for 3 years, Thomas. Never knew you were one of us." He touched the Vietnam veteran pin on his vest before heading back to the bar. The young biker with the neck tattoo, who'd introduced himself as Mike, leaned forward. "But why here?" he asked, gesturing at the small town around them. "Guy with your skills could be doing private security, making big money in the city." Thomas pulled out his daughter's photo again, laying it gently on the table. The bikers leaned in to look. "This is Alice," he said, his voice soft but clear. "She was studying to be a teacher. Had a way with kids that would amaze you. They just naturally trusted her." He paused, running his thumb along the edge of the photo. "Lost her mom to cancer when she was 16. But Alice, she just kept going, kept smiling. Said she was going to make a difference in the world." Bear nodded slowly, his own eyes showing a deep understanding. "The accident?" he asked quietly. 2 years ago," Thomas replied. "Drunk driver. She was coming home from student teaching." He took another sip of bourbon. "After that, I couldn't stand the city anymore. Too many memories. Too much noise. Needed somewhere quiet to figure things out." The sheriff, who had been listening from nearby, pulled up a chair. "That's why you've been helping out at the Veterans Center," he said. It wasn't a question. "Saw you working on that garden out back." Thomas nodded. "Alice always loved gardens. Said they were like little pieces of hope growing out of the ground." He smiled slightly. "Figured maybe some other vets might find some peace there too. It's not much, but it's everything." Bear interrupted, his voice rough with emotion. "Lost my brother in Desert Storm. Sometimes the only place I can really think about him is in places like that. Somewhere quiet, you know." Mike, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "My uncle. He served in Afghanistan too. Came back different. Won't talk about it, won't get help. just sits in his room most days. He looked at Thomas with newfound respect. But maybe he'd like to help with that garden. Thomas studied the young man for a moment before nodding. Garden always needs tending, he said simply. And sometimes it's easier to talk when your hands are busy with the earth. Bear reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a worn notebook. Got guys in our club, veterans who are struggling. Been trying to find ways to help them. But, he looked at Thomas. Maybe we could work something out. Bring some of them here, help with the garden. The conversation continued, turning from memories of service to plans for the future. The other bar patrons, who had been watching the scene unfold, gradually returned to their own conversations, but there was a new respect in how they looked at the corner table. The next morning dawned crisp and clear over the Veterans Center garden. Thomas arrived early, as he always did, but today was different. He wasn't alone. Bear and his crew had parked their bikes in the lot, looking somewhat out of place next to the center's weathered sign. Not sure I remember the last time I was up this early without being at the end of a long night. Bear joked, but his eyes were clear and focused as he surveyed the garden space. The morning sun caught the dew on the half-finished flower beds, making them sparkle like scattered diamonds. Thomas handed out work gloves and basic tools, showing them where he'd been planning to extend the garden. Thinking of putting in a meditation path, he explained, pointing to an open area. Something winding, with benches in quiet spots, places where people can sit and think. Mike, looking different in the morning light without his tough guy expression from the night before, picked up a shovel. My uncle, he said hesitantly, the one I mentioned. He used to have this amazing vegetable garden before he went to war. Maybe we could add something like that. Thomas nodded, already seeing the possibilities. Fresh vegetables for the center's kitchen, he said. Give people a reason to come back, watch things grow. He paused, remembering something. Alice used to say that growing food was like making hope visible. The work started slowly at first, as the bikers found their rhythm. But there was something therapeutic about the simple act of turning earth, of creating something new. Their leather jackets came off as the morning warmed up, revealing faded military tattoos and old scars. Marks of stories they were finally ready to share. Had a buddy in Iraq, Bear said as he helped position a heavy bench. Best marksman I ever knew. Came home, couldn't handle the noise of the city. Ended up living in the woods for a while. He straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead. Something like this might have helped him. Somewhere between the chaos and the isolation. Other veterans from town began showing up, drawn by curiosity about the unusual group working in the garden. Instead of the suspicion you might expect, there was a kind of understanding. They saw past the leather and patches to something familiar, the look of men trying to find their way home. My daughter would have loved this, Thomas said during a water break, looking at the progress they'd made. She always said healing happens better in groups. He pulled out her photo again, but this time when he showed it, there was more pride than sadness in his voice. The sheriff stopped by around noon, bringing sandwiches from the diner down the street. He walked the growing paths with Thomas, nodding appreciatively. You know, he said, I've been trying to get some of our local vets to come to the center for years. Sometimes all it takes is the right reason. As the afternoon wore on, plans began taking shape. Bear talked about bringing more veterans from their club, not just for gardening, but for regular meetings. Mike had already called his uncle, who agreed to come look at the vegetable garden idea. Even Randy from the bar showed up, offering to organize a weekly cookout using the garden's harvest. Funny how things work out, Thomas said as they wrapped up for the day. Yesterday morning, I was just a carpenter who liked his quiet. Now, he gestured at the transformed garden space where tough-looking bikers were carefully planting flowers alongside local veterans. Bear clasped his shoulder, the gesture carrying the weight of shared understanding. Sometimes the best things come from the worst beginnings, he said. Almost lost my teeth to a special forces vet. Ended up finding a new purpose instead. Over the next few weeks, the Veterans Center Garden became a place of unexpected transformations. What started as Thomas's quiet project had grown into something much bigger. The Road Hunters MC members became regular visitors, their bikes lined up neatly in the parking lot every Saturday morning. Mike's uncle finally showed up one Tuesday morning, standing awkwardly at the garden's edge. His hands were shaking slightly as he watched Thomas work, but when Thomas handed him a packet of tomato seeds without saying a word, something in the man's eyes shifted. By afternoon, he was explaining proper planting depths to two younger vets with the confidence of someone who'd found familiar ground. "Never thought I'd see the day," Randy said one evening, watching from the bar's window as another group of bikes pulled into town. These weren't road hunters. They were from other clubs, other towns, drawn by word of mouth about a place where veterans could find peace without having to talk about why they needed it. The garden expanded naturally, like a living thing finding its own way to grow. The meditation path wound between raised vegetable beds and flowering plants, with benches placed in quiet spots where the morning sun felt just right. Someone, nobody quite remembered who, started leaving small stones along the path, each one painted with the name of a fallen friend or family member. Thomas kept his daughter's photo in his jacket pocket, but now he shared her story more freely. Alice would have been right in the middle of this, he told a young veteran who was struggling with crowds. She knew everyone learns to heal differently. Sometimes you need quiet, sometimes you need purpose, and sometimes you just need to watch something grow. Bear and his original crew became regulars at Randy's bar, but not like before. They'd come in quietly, grab a corner table, not Thomas's corner. They'd learned that lesson, and often spent their evenings talking with other vets who'd heard about the garden and the community growing around it. One Saturday morning, Thomas arrived at the garden to find something new. Someone had installed a small plaque near the entrance. It read, "Alice's Garden, where hope grows." He stood there for a long time, running his fingers over the letters. "Hope you don't mind," Bear said, appearing quietly beside him. The boys took up a collection. Figured she'd like knowing her story helped start all this. He gestured at the garden, now full of life and color. Veterans of different ages and backgrounds worked side by side, some talking, others content in shared silence. Mike's uncle had become a daily fixture, teaching gardening skills to anyone who showed interest. His hands didn't shake anymore when he talked about his service. Instead, they moved confidently through the soil, helping new plants take root. The sheriff often brought first-time visitors, usually veterans who were having a hard time adjusting to civilian life. "Just come see the garden," he'd tell them. "You don't have to talk. You don't have to do anything. Just see what's growing there." Local families started bringing their children to help with the easier gardening tasks. The kids didn't know why some of the tough-looking men had tears in their eyes while planting flowers, but they understood something special was happening in this space. "It's like ripples in a pond," Thomas said one evening at Randy's, watching another group of motorcycles rumble into town. "You never know how far they'll go or what shores they'll touch." He pulled out Alice's photo, looking at it with a smile that held more peace than sadness. Sometimes the best kind of strength isn't in fighting. It's in knowing how to help others find their way back. 1 year after the night that changed everything, Thomas sat in his usual corner at Randy's bar, but the scene around him was completely different. The bar had become an unofficial meeting point for veterans from all over the state. Tonight, bikers in leather jackets shared tables with retired soldiers, swapping stories and finding common ground over cold beers. Randy had hung a new photo on the wall behind the bar. A group shot taken in the garden during their first harvest festival. In it, Thomas stood quietly to one side, but his small smile told its own story. Next to the photo hung a simple frame containing pressed flowers from Alice's garden. "You know what I realized?" Bear said, settling into the chair across from Thomas. He looked different now, still imposing in his leather vest, but his eyes carried a gentler light. "That night when we first met, we thought we were looking for trouble. Turns out we were looking for something else. Just didn't know it yet. The young biker Mike, who'd grown from an uncertain troublemaker into one of the garden's most dedicated volunteers, joined them with fresh drinks. Uncle Joe's teaching another gardening class tomorrow, he announced proudly. His uncle had become the garden's unofficial master gardener, his knowledge helping countless other veterans find their footing. 6 new guys showed up this morning, Thomas said, taking a sip of his bourbon. 2 of them didn't say a word, just sat on the meditation path for hours. By afternoon, one was helping with the tomatoes. He paused, a gentle smile crossing his face. Reminded me of someone else who used to heal people just by being patient with them. The sheriff appeared at their table, no longer needing to check for trouble, but simply joining the evening conversation. Got a call from the VA hospital in the city, he said. They're interested in starting something similar. Wanted to know if some of our folks would help set it up. Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out Alice's photo. The edges were still worn, but now it was accompanied by another picture, the garden in full bloom, with veterans of all ages working together among the flowers and vegetables. He looked at both photos for a long moment. Life's got a funny way of growing new paths, he said quietly. A year ago, I was just trying to find some peace in my corner. Now look at us. He gestured around the bar, where former strangers had become family, where healing happened in quiet conversations and shared understanding. Bear raised his glass. To Alice, he said solemnly, who taught us all something about strength and peace, even though we never met her. The toast spread through the bar as others joined in, many of them knowing the story that had started it all. Some had their own stories now, of nightmares eased by mornings in the garden, of friendships formed over shared work, of healing found in unexpected places. Thomas still enjoyed his quiet moments, but they were different now. His solitude was a choice rather than a refuge, and his corner at Randy's was open to anyone who needed a quiet place to find their way back to themselves. You know what Alice used to say? Thomas asked, looking around at the unlikely family that had grown from that one tense night. She'd say that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who know when to put down their fists and open their hands instead. Took me a while to understand what she meant. The evening wound down peacefully, the bar filled with a soft murmur of conversations and occasional laughter. Outside, motorcycles and pickup trucks sat side by side in the parking lot, their owners no longer divided by appearances or assumptions. As Thomas prepared to leave, he paused to look at his daughter's photo one more time. You were right, sweetheart, he whispered. The best kind of strength is the one that brings people together. He carefully tucked the photo away, nodding to Randy as he stepped into the cool night air, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of quiet growth in Alice's garden.